Hello, everybody. We holding this third session of consciousness dialogue for experimentalists and theorists. Okay, so today Alex Maier is going to talk about this year's ASSC24 meeting, Science of Consciousness, and give some thoughts. All right, Alex, do you want to talk about this brief overview of what the ASSC is?
Yeah, so it's probably a good starting point to talk about this conference. So I took it from the ASSC website that, interestingly enough, they got founded in 1994 by a group of consciousness researchers. Some are listed here under the first executive board. And it actually took a couple of years until 1997 until they had their first conference. And my understanding is, with the exception of last year because of COVID, I think there's been a conference every year ever since. And those these conferences for the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness, they tend to be organized by local committees and have traveled the whole world. So they've been, I think, on every major continent except Antarctica. I think there's been an ASSC conference. And so, of course, you and I, we also met for the first time at one of these conferences in Pasadena in California.
Yeah. All right. So, and then, so this year.
So this year was the first conference that happened not in meet space, not with people meeting together, but virtually over Zoom, as we're doing right now. So that was a big change, of course, because of COVID. It was organized still by the committee in Israel and Tel Aviv, where it should have happened last year. And so instead, this year they said, let's do it online via Zoom. And having been a participant, I can say it's been a glaring success. So I want to thank the organizers and congratulate the organizers. I've been to multiple Zoom-run conferences over the last year, and this probably was the best by far.
Oh, really?
And it paid off. Yeah, it was very smooth. They had some technical issues. I think they always come with Zoom, but they found really great ways to go over them. And then what I found really interesting was right at the beginning, they said that there were over 500 participants, which I think is a huge number. For this topic, and certainly a very different crowd size from the conference where you and I met about 10 or more years ago.
But I have a couple of questions. So all the talks were like keynote talks and things like that were Zoom?
Yeah, so keynote talks, so every day it would start with a session of keynote talks. And what they did is they used the Zoom webinar function for that. So everybody was taking part at the same time, watching the same talks, and was able to address questions with the Q&A function in Zoom, which I think is fantastic because it allows people to upvote questions that they also agree with or also would like to hear answered.
Right.
So there's a democratic system in terms of who gets the microphone in the end, which question gets asked. And I think that's interesting also because sometimes you feel that there's sometimes issues where you might wonder what other people think, and you get a feeling of the temperature in the room, if you will. You see that, actually, most people agree with me, or most people disagree with me as an audience member when you see these up and down votes. So that was really great. And then after these talks, there were like 2 or 3 every day where everybody joined. Then there would be breakout sessions. And because there were so many participants, there would be 7 or 8 sessions running in parallel. And there was a program that you could see, they were all timed. So you could jump between different Zoom channels if you were interested in a particular talk. You could leave one session and then join a different session. And I saw a lot of people do that. So with 7 or 8 sessions running in parallel, that was a great tool to have.
I see. And but this format may actually work really well for ASSC in particular, right? Because I do remember there is a kind of, very sort of famous question guy within ASC tradition. Every time when you go there, this guy who asks that question, a really long question, it's almost like his talk. But, it was also kind of annoying at the same time. But if the question is ranked order by the popular vote, that would be actually really well. Oh, David Camero is also saying that it worked really well, but it turns out that the type of Zoom license really matters. There are more sessions than allowed in the license, so we were asked to create new links. So I see.
Yeah, so that happened. So I think it was on the second day of the conference or so where things all of a sudden didn't work. But that's, again, where I feel the organizers did a great job, that emails went out to everybody and they joined all of the live sessions and made sure that everybody got the new links. But so that did happen, that links and passwords had to be updated. It's interesting. I didn't know about the technical issues. But so some of the other conferences where I was at, it had happened much more, that all of a sudden the link, the Zoom disappeared or other problems. So it really felt fantastic meeting everybody, even if it was online. Of course, none of us, we all, I think, wait eagerly that we can meet again in person. But overall, it was really very well run. And so we should also mention that as you said, one of the reasons that these concurrent sessions are important, that ASSC is a very unique conference. So we're living in times of interdisciplinarity, and this is a very interdisciplinary conference. So I think the original idea was to bring philosophers that are interested in philosophy of mind and the philosophy of consciousness and brain and mind together with people, neuroscientists, that actually try to study that. And so it's, in that sense, a long-running, very successful experiment to have people that come from very different end of the spectrum that are interested in the same problem and have them come together and join forces. And so, yes, if you look at the different sessions, you have some sessions that are hardcore neuroscience and some sessions that are hardcore philosophy of mind and everything in between.
I see. Yeah, but I'm actually interested if David Carmel from New Zealand wants to join this conversation, because he was our time zone, and the biggest hurdle for me in Australia is that to join this in this midnight, which I don't want to do. So they announce that all the talks and the keynotes become available on YouTube or not?
Well, that's a really good question. I know that there were recordings being done. So I know that the big talks were definitely recorded. And then even the smaller session that I participated in, often there was a quick survey or quick making sure that everybody would be okay to be recorded. So I know that sessions were recorded. Really good question whether they will become available.
I see. Yeah. But as I'm more and more aware that many of the bigger conference or medium conference like this size are really centered around Europe and so US, right? So if it continues, then Asia Pacific audience will eventually get isolated from the sphere of the science. So I really think we need to kind of bring the temperature up for the Asian, kind of scientific community.
Yeah, so I definitely see that problem, and so I think for ASSC, I think the answer is that next year it will be in person again. So I think it will be in Amsterdam, and so that might be a way to get around this problem. But yeah, as you said, they already, I think since even the US has several time zones, I saw that they really tried to stretch around the globe as much as they could. But I'm aware that I saw Ryota, and I think it was 3 a.m. in one of the sessions for him. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. That's great. And there was some also comment from David and also Ariel. Yeah, so there is another conference called Models of Consciousness, and I saw the announcement, and it looks like, again, it starts from us, 1 a.m. until 7 a.m. or something. So it's kind of annoying. Yeah. All right.
So maybe, shall we move on to
Let's move on.
Topics?
Yeah.
So I wrote down some of the things that kind of emerged for me, but so it's important to keep in mind that I was also hopping around these 7 or 8 symposia that happened at the same time. So it's a very biased and personal perspective. But what I found interesting was when they started the conference, they had a word cloud that they put together from the abstracts.
Yeah.
And so, and they said from the word cloud, it seemed that there was a strong empirical focus. So those are the organizers' words, not mine. And that was certainly also my feeling, that there was a lot of neuroscience. There was a lot of different sessions at the same time, neuroscience. So strong empirical focus, especially maybe for people like you and I who have been present at the conference throughout the years, where sometimes it seemed to ebb and wane, or maybe where the philosophy side or the neuroscience side seemed to predominate. So this was a very empirical conference.
But
what I also found interesting,
historically, ASSC tends to be really empirically focused, really, compared to other side of the consciousness conference, which we haven't actually mentioned, Tucson, originated from Tucson towards science of consciousness. They have lots of theoretical or metaphysical or religious, spiritual kind of talk, and ASSC was really originating from those people who wants to kind of establish empirical science of consciousness. So yeah, the original goal still continues probably. Yep. Okay.
Yeah, so another big word, as I have it one below, is vision. Still is probably the dominating sense or one of the dominating avenues to do research on consciousness. And so related to that, there was a lot of maybe a little bit of thinking back over what has been accomplished over the last couple of years, and what was heralded, especially by Axel Kleremann's presidential lecture, was that the ways that we measure consciousness behaviorally, that we do psychophysics, that we measure, especially in vision science, consciousness, that there has been a lot of refinement in terms of learning about no report paradigms, other ways that to be careful about what are we actually measuring. And then the next thing was that I thought, that was my personal thought when it comes to the conference, that it was about models and models and models and models. So, and that's a little bit the leitmotif maybe for the next points here as well. So obviously computation is a growing big topic. So I saw it with great interest that computational consciousness had a whole session now. Right? So that is certainly something when we met for the first time at ASSC, we might not have seen coming, that artificial intelligence and machine learning is a huge part, and everything in between when it comes to computation.
That's kind of interesting. When I was a part of the steering committee for 2 or 3 years, like maybe 5 years ago or something, I actually suggested to have one keynote speakers from like AI or computational neuroscience, and then everybody was against me because it's nothing to do with consciousness. But yeah, I'm glad to see that it's coming. Great.
I should mention that there was debate. So I do remember that a very prominent speaker said at some point we should drop the N out of computational neural networks because it has nothing to do with neuroscience. So there's certainly debate around this, but it's definitely growing, and so I saw it with great interest.
It's just a method, right? I mean, whether it actually, tells us anything about consciousness or not is something that we don't know yet. But at least, I think we can, at least as long as this kind of, approach tackles with the problem of consciousness, phenomenology in particular, then I think it's, fine. Okay, anyway.
Yeah, I had a shower thought today that maybe also AI is where empiricism and theoreticians, where it gets blurry, right? So because typically we think of empiricism that we study a system or we study nature, but AI is reaching the point where we're studying artificial intelligence or artificial consciousness, as some people would even say at this point, and we're studying it as a phenomenon of nature. So it's not really a theoretician's game anymore. So there's almost like, this is where the two realms meet. I found that really interesting.
Okay.
Now the next one I found interesting. So I forget the authors on this very long paper, but they collected a survey on 2 previous meetings of the ASSC. Right? There it is, yes. And so they were asking all of the people present very interesting questions about their opinions on consciousness research, including which model of consciousness or the neuroscience of consciousness they favor. And the surprising outcome was that some of the maybe most famous models, such as the global neuronal workspace theory or integrated information theory, that did not as good as predictive coding. So that was something that really popped out to me, that predictive coding seems to be the leading model, if you will, among the specialists that meet at this conference.
It's I also felt that the audience was highly biased towards the European participants, right? Wasn't it?
Yes, I think that was one of the conferences was meeting in Europe, and so it was among the people that participated in that one.
Like more than half was from Europe. And if you are in Europe, definitely you will hear predictive coding all the time. And participants of ASSC doesn't necessarily need to be, the consciousness researchers. So that may also, at least to explain some of the results. And I think there was also, maybe I can't find the figure, so maybe I'll just leave it, but there is some here, table 2, I think. Yeah, so this is the one that I mentioned to you a bit, like Spearman's correlation for 5 main theories and main definition questions, and predictive coding and phenomenal consciousness has no correlation, almost.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's very interesting.
Yeah, so if you are interested in brain, yeah, I would say that it has a possible relevance, but not sure whether it was the direct prediction or interpretation we can make.
It's very interesting. I should also mention that when these results were presented, David Chalmers was in the audience and said that he is about to publish a similar survey that was run among philosophers. So it'd be very interesting to see the outcome of that one.
Yeah. Anyway, this Franken's survey paper is now available in Psych Archive, and I'll just paste this link here. And in the chat, so if you're interested, you can take a look. Okay, there was some comments. So Ariel says that the favoritism of the predictive coding doesn't necessarily mean much, given a predictive coding theory of consciousness has not actually been formalized. Okay. All right, so then coming back here.
Yeah, so I found this interesting. One of the sessions, as I said, there were 7 or 8 sessions run in parallel. There were about 500 participants. So one of the sessions was about the question of the neural correlates being in the back of the brain only, in the front only, or maybe both. So that's obviously a very lively debate that is still going on. And there were 122 participants.
So this is a parallel session?
Yes.
Okay. And then there are 5 or 7 streams, and then only one actually consumed 120. Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So I thought that was extremely interesting. And that session led into maybe the next point here, that I saw there's a lot of funding going into this research. And so that was something that came up again and again and again. I put it here to the left-hand side as well, making the hard problem of consciousness easier, which is the science paper that just came out, I think, a week or 2 ago, by Roger Maloney, Mudrik, Michael Pitts, and Christoph Koch. And so this is, of course, about the millions of dollars of funding from the Templeton Foundation that will go in this project that is called Adversarial Collaboration, which is pitting 2 of the greatest, most influential models of consciousness, the global neuronal works theory and integrated information theory, against each other. So it's a friendly collaboration, but it's adversarial because the goal is to have one of the 2 theories win at the expense of the other. And so, of course, the front versus back debate is one way to decide between these 2 theories, with the global neuronal workspace theory leaning towards front matters, versus the integrated information theory camp arguing that the back of the brain may be sufficient.
I see. All right. Then the next one.
Yeah, so I found this very interesting. I felt that there is an increasing ongoing hunt for behavioral markers. What I mean by that is ways to find out if a human, or maybe even other systems, are conscious or not. So that is obviously something that has been on a lot of people's minds for a long time, because it would allow us to find neuronal correlates and other things. So instrumental conditioning, I know that fear conditioning was one of these tasks that has been suggested before to not work if you put subjects under anesthesia. And so instrumental conditioning was another one that was suggested. And then actually the talk of the William James Prize, the William James Award, which goes to a young leading researcher in consciousness. You're one of the people who got that award. So that went to an interesting paper that was published in Nature last year that actually had escaped my attention, which is that they measured the sniffing of comatose patients to different odorants and found that that had predictive power about whether or not they might have been conscious, and also for them coming out of coma.
Yeah.
So that was not neuroscience in the strictest sense, but I think it's an important tool. It's interesting that there's progress there and research going on.
Okay. Yeah, that's Anat's study, right?
Yes.
I forgot her last name, but yeah.
Yeah, congrats again for the award.
Yeah.
And then lastly, and so this is a very personal thought, I felt that there were several symposia that touched on gradualism. And what I mean by gradualism is the notion that consciousness is not all or one, but that consciousness might be a phenomenon that varies from 0 to a certain measure, and that there's anything in between possible. And so that matters in two ways. One is evolutionarity. That's what I mean here with phylogenetics. So when we think about us humans being conscious, and us having evolved from other non-human species, can we draw a line where consciousness has evolved at some point? We don't believe, for example, that bacteria are conscious, or protozoans or other. So at what point in the evolutionary tree do we think consciousness has emerged? And so that naturally leads to gradualism, possibly, unless you make a very hard cut and you say at this point in evolution, consciousness all of a sudden emerged. And then likewise, there was talk about the ontogenetic side of consciousness. So there were several studies, very interesting studies, big talks about behavioral markers of consciousness in infants and babies. And very interesting studies that I wasn't aware of, showing that it seemed to me moving that when we think we're dealing with a conscious being earlier and earlier back in time. And there again, the idea that consciousness might not just all of a sudden turn on, and we are conscious beings, but maybe slowly ramp up from 0 to a certain number. And then obviously that also affects, so the interesting questions were asked by some people about brain organoids, that we're using bigger and bigger tissues of neural tissue to do research on. At what point do we have to worry that that's actually conscious, what we're measuring, what we're putting in a jar right there? And then lastly, AI, of course. When might AI turn into consciousness? And we have to be careful and worry about questions like suffering. So that was a little new to me. And it's, of course, interesting if you are interested in topics like neuronal workspace or IIT, these theories, they also have something to say about whether consciousness is gradual or not.
Yeah, so about that, there was some also comments here. The paper that you described about sniffing response is this one, right? Anat Arzi's group. And basically, yeah, comparing this response of the sniffing under the coma or vegetative states and things like that. And then Aniko pointed out that this kind of sniffing response is actually possible to measure in animals, and that also leads to this gradualism kind of idea. And if I remember correctly, one of the keynote speakers is Jablonka, no? Wasn't it? Like evolutionary scientist. No?
I might have missed that talk,
okay.
Unless you could. I might have missed a talk. So this is literally just me taking many different sessions and talks together and thinking about what is new to me or what seems to be emerging.
Yeah, but this evolutionary study of the consciousness, Jablonka, and also ontogenetic start is definitely also interesting. And these things, brain organized and also AI, all kind of implies the ethical issues of consciousness, right? That's one of the, she wasn't a keynote. Okay, so I think Jablonka may be a keynote speaker for the mathematical consciousness conference. Maybe I was wrong.
Interesting.
In terms of keynote, there was a Yuval Noah Harari, right? Harari.
And so that was about the ethics.
Okay.
Yeah, so if I recall correctly, yeah,
I
and so
see.
the ethical implications of consciousness research that come with all of these questions in terms of it was a strong focus on suffering, up to the point of almost equating consciousness with a potential to suffer. And so that caused an interesting debate in terms of is that not too narrow a theory? And an interesting case that I hadn't heard about a patient in the UK, I believe, that not only is incapable of experiencing pain, but maybe negative affect in general, but seems to lead a normal life, is a successful mother and successful person. So yeah, that was certainly an interesting debate. But yeah, the ethical side in terms of being careful that what is conscious might also be suffering, but also maybe in this case with AI, the broader debate, whether we want to extinguish anything that might be conscious.
I'm curious, but so you're saying that there is a person who cannot perceive pain or negative affect? I thought that those people who are born without the pain experience tend to die really early. No?
Yeah, so I didn't go and do the exact research about that. I was also interested in that. I teach on pain perception, and so what I remember is there's a famous case of a woman that died in her 20s, and she died of self-inflicted wounds because she would leave her hand on the stove and not realize that she was getting burned, and chew on her own tongue without realizing that she would be doing that, and
Wow.
so she died of infections early on. So with this patient, that's new to me as well. But so the claim was that woman doesn't even feel negative things in general, so not just pain, but seems to be a very happy person all around. And so that would question this idea that consciousness can be equated to the potential to suffer.
Yeah, I mean AI at least doesn't have a pain receptor unless you add it. So I don't know. Probably Thomas Metzinger and other people also talk about potential ethical issues about AI, right?
Yes, yes, and so actually, I think he gave a keynote talk the year prior at ASSC.
Yeah.
I missed that one, but people drew parallels and said that was a great and interesting talk about that. But yeah, I think that some AI researchers say that that embodiment may be important, and so that to actually reach consciousness, we should think about robots and make sure that AI isn't just a brain in a vat, but interacts with the world, and that might require pain receptors and negative stimuli as well.
Yeah. And okay, so to wrap it up about this part, so I think this kind of topic will be really important to think about also the role of the study of the consciousness research in the society or into the future, funding wise also, or the usage of the public money basically. So we will probably need to raise the awareness along this line, I think. And there was some comment. There is from Ariel. There is a variety of pain asymbolia cases. Depends on the cause. You can have various ion channel mutations that lead to different kinds, but there is probably amygdala abnormalities that can happen too. Yeah, that's right. All right, let's go.
Yeah, and so this one I put in because it struck me how many different models there are around and how many different speakers seem to favor one model over the other. And so this was another very interesting paper or study that's about to come out, looking at different publications and what model of consciousness they investigated.
Yeah.
And so that's another interesting one in terms of maybe looking at which models are leading models, which one are the most commonly investigated, most commonly used. I think the global neuronal workspace model here led by far. But the claim was, and you see this to the left-hand side here, so these are different brains, and so they're brain activation patterns that were meta-analyzed from these studies. And what they showed is that studies that favor global workspace theory, shown here in red to the left, they tended to find broad activation that's consciousness related, whereas studies that are interested in integrated information theory, shown here in yellow, or theories that are interested in recurrent activation, they find more localized activity. And then higher order theories of consciousness, shown here as hot in blue, they would find more frontal activation. So they asked the question, how does this come about? And so maybe the more interesting question, don't we have enough theories? And why doesn't it happen as in other fields that if there are many theories that we're weeding out the good ones from the ones that are not as good? And the claim that they made in the study is that people tend to publish on a theory that they already seem to favor, and that these studies seem to more seek support for theories than they try to falsify.
Yeah.
And so there was a lot of debate about basically in how far these theories are falsifiable and whether there shouldn't be a more concerted effort in falsifying theories. And of course, the answer is the adversarial collaboration that is going on is trying to do exactly that.
Yeah.
So this is where things came back in a loop.
Yeah, so
But,
this is part of the abstract, but we found that supporting specific theory can be predicted solely from methodological choices, irrespective of findings, and most of these interpret their findings post hoc rather than a priori testing critical predictions of the theories. Right? Yeah. And we are really trying to do this looks, by the way, is a very nice meta-analytic study. I haven't read it, but this problem of the post hoc analysis is definitely big in many of the field outside of the consciousness already. And last year or 2 years ago in fMRI study where they sent out all the data to many different kind of labs, and then they analyzed the data in different way, and then they came up with a completely different conclusion. And all these things are probably influenced by what kind of results each of these PIs or student wants to prove. So to really avoid that, we need some kind of mechanism, like pre-registration is one thing, and the registered report is definitely a way to go, I think, and we are trying to do it. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. Did they also discuss something like that, like sharing the data, open science practice, sharing the code, making many things as transparent as possible?
Not that I remember. I think that the call was more about focusing on falsification. There were other talks that talked about falsifiability in general. And but yeah, I agree with your point. It's a very interesting idea that to connect it with open science and broad data dissemination and what's it called, pre-registration to register a study before you actually do it, and so you're blind to the results.
All right.
Yeah, so lastly, I thought as we're wrapping up here, this might be interesting for you. So there is a lot of talk about or other people that I saw that are increasingly talking about tackling qualia in terms of structure. So looking at relationships, at geometries, and then the Nico Krieges-Kortes approach of representational similarity analysis. So in particular, Rafi Malak gave an excellent talk with very interesting new findings from human recordings, from human cortex. And so he has been using this technique. So there's definitely increasing awareness of that. And so it seems to be something that is catching fire. So that I found extremely interesting. I went to a session that was interested in complexity measurements, which reminded me of tools from IIT that you're using, that I'm interested in using. But it was largely about the Lemper-Siff complexity measure. And so it's about levels of consciousness rather than contents of consciousness. So seeing if somebody is aware or not. They use psychedelic drugs and other ways to change the state of consciousness. And so what popped out there was that I think a criticism that has existed before is, are you really measuring brain complexity, or does it not just simply reflect the fact that as you become more and more unconscious, your brain drifts into a deeper and deeper low frequency state? And as you get more alert and more vigilant and aroused, you get more gamma activity, high frequency activity. And the answer is that yes, that's actually to a large degree what this reflects. So they did a very interesting study where they tried to compare just looking at the spectrum of brain oscillations, and they found that to a large degree these things go hand in hand. There's some minute differences that are probably interesting to go after, but I found that was interesting, that these
I
two
see.
things are not dissociable.
I see. But the still the problem I see is, maybe we are a little bit ahead of the time, but we are doing the kind of the analysis like this, but in our case, we are trying to apply pretty much all the measures that are known right now, and using this toolbox called HCTSA, which contains 7,000 many different analysis technique applied on the same data, and then see which one actually correlates with what, and also whether we can predict the presence or absence of consciousness or perception versus non-perception with any of the measures in a double-blind manner. And unless you do that kind of fair comparison, really from the start of the which measure to compare, I really have lots of difficulty in believing in this kind of claim, because depending on the data, depending on the measure, you can find lots of correlation or non-correlation, and there are lots of complexity measures, and a spectral measure also has a many different kind of versions. So yeah, this is an interesting kind of direction, and I will probably try to publish along this lines from our lab, but it is tricky question to address. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, maybe to wrap it all up, then there was a lot of debate, as we said earlier, about AI, machine learning, and what we can learn for consciousness. And so what I wrote down here is, so there's this criticism to say, well, it's not a brain, and so what can we learn here? And so I think Rafi Malach made this interesting point. He borrowed from, I think if I got it correct, from a movement that I find interesting that's been going on in biology for quite a while, which is called structuralism. I think it was very popular in Europe, and it points that evolution may not be quite as random as we think. And it points as the overwhelming amount of convergent evolution that we find from the molecular all the way to the level of species, and arguing that that may be evidence for, let's put it more extremely, of platonic shapes that evolution almost teleologically works towards. Another way to think about this is that fitness happens in a landscape, and that in order to survive, organisms have to find a local minimum in the fitness landscape. And so that might explain why similar organisms fall into the same local minimum. But that would mean that there is a meta law, if you will, a biological law, or a natural law that explains that if you want to have a certain ecological niche, this is the way to do it. So this reminds me of Jarvis' work on songbirds. And I remember when he gave a talk, he once said that he looked at all the different species of birds that can replicate a sound, and they're not related, all of them. And he found that they always have the same neural circuit. And when he then compared it to humans, and I forget, elephants, there's some other species that also can mimic sounds, he found pretty much the exact same species on some level of abstraction. So he in his talk would say that if we ever find aliens, if green men arrive in a UFO on Earth and they're able to use language and produce sounds, he can predict what neural circuits they would have, because it seems to be a law of the universe that if you want to reproduce sounds, you need to have this mechanism, this neural mechanism. And so if that is true, then we could use AI and machine learning to learn about similar laws that might work for consciousness. So if there's only certain ways that consciousness can be implemented, then doing that in a computer would also, and finding a parallel as it's happening in our brains, would help us to learn about big laws of consciousness that nature has to obey in this universe. So I thought that was an interesting idea.
Yeah, I guess it has a very similar kind of idea or consistent idea with like causal structuralism, or because the neurons are connected in this way, then that has to contribute to this aspect of the consciousness, like color or sound or motion and so on. So it also depends on how each of these neurons are likely to be activated or deactivated because of their biophysical kind of tendency and so on. And that's something that we are interested in, also going in that kind of directions. Many people are probably converging kind of ideas in that sense. Otherwise, I can't really imagine how this, different areas of the brain generates different kind of sensation, qualia, really.
Mm.
Mm. Okay. Yeah.
So the one thing that was there was a lot of debate about
Mm.
this issue, which I found interesting. And so the one thing that was admitted by the proponents of studying artificial consciousness is that so far the machine learning artificial intelligence side is non-dynamic. And so that seems to clash with the theories that we have about the brain that really emphasize feedback, reverberation, oscillations, a lot of things changing as a function of time. Whereas the neural models, at least so far, most of them are ballistic, or they ignore time entirely and live in a timeless space. And so that maybe in order to make progress on the artificial side of consciousness, that this might have to be play a more prominent role, that things stay dynamic and change as a function of time.
Yeah. That's good point. All right. Is there any other things that you wanted to talk, or no further comments from the audience? So if there's nothing else, then we can wrap it up today. Thanks a lot
Sounds
for
good.
that. Yep. Yeah. Thanks a lot for your lots of thoughts and interesting comments. Great.
Yes, thanks for the questions.
Yep. All right.
Take care.
Bye bye.